The following podcast contains mature themes and is intended for an adult audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to another episode of Summa Made Simple. In this episode, which is part 3 of 3 in our discussion around question 154, Article 1, into what parts lust is divided. And in the last 2 episodes, we went into this question, especially with respect to the body of the article, where St. Thomas Aquinas gives his response to the question whether the 6 types of lust are fittingly assigned. And now, rather than going into the objections and the replies to the objections which are given here, I thought I would take a slightly different approach. So what was the challenge? The challenge is that the objections which are given here, granted, are very relevant and are also very theological and kind of like very philosophical. And I thought to myself, listen, in the 21st century, these are not the objections which I feel that the man on the street is going to put towards this particular question. And this is a very important issue. Why? Because it is the issue around which most Christians are divided. Oh, look, I'll speak specifically about the Catholic Church. Like I saw a poll the other day, and I'll put a link to it in the description, where they had asked Americans in the United States about the issues where there was some kind of contention with respect to their views versus what they taught that the church teaches. And the issue where most Americans seemed to strongly disagree, I mean, the one which stood out the most was the issue of contraception, where most Catholic Americans felt that the church should not in any way, shape, or form tell people or teach people or have anything to do with this aspect of contraception. And look, this question actually touches a lot on that, this question of the Summa. So I thought, you know what, let's actually tackle that objection rather than the objections and the replies to the objections which St. Thomas gives. Now, how did I go about this? I used AI. So I took this question, this article, whether the 6 species of are fittingly assigned to lust, and I fed it into a large language model with the following prompt. Let me read the prompt out to you. I said, play the role of a Harvard graduate who is a radical leftist and pro-choice and pro-LGBT. Critique and destroy the arguments in the following passage from St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, maximum 120 words output. Because, yeah, I just hate it when LLMs just go on and on and on and try to avoid getting to the point. Anyway, that's besides the point. This was its reply. Its reply was, okay, let's dismantle this. Aquinas built a whole taxonomy of sexual sin, and the word sin, by the way, is in quotes. Aquinas builds a whole taxonomy of sexual, open quotes, sin, close quotes, on the assumption that reproduction is the sole legitimate telos or end of sex, which conveniently pathologizes queer intimacy, contraception, and any pleasure not aimed at procreation. That's not moral philosophy. It's biology dressed up as metaphysics. Worse, women aren't even agents here, where, open quotes, matter, closed quotes, acted upon, our worth defined by whose, open quotes, authority, close quotes, we belong to, such as father or husband. Rape and adultery are categorized by property violation, not consent violation. That's not ethics, that's patriarchal accounting. Right reason here just means 13th century social hierarchy. Strip the Latin scaffolding and its homophobia, misogyny, and reproductive coercion wearing a toga of logic. So I replied, you haven't actually rationally dismantled the arguments but have used slogans against it. Give me reasons, logic and rationales, max 120 words output. And this is what it said. Fair. Here's the actual argument. Aquinas infers moral status from biological function. This is the naturalistic fallacy. Because an organ can produce offspring, using it otherwise is against nature, quote unquote, against nature. But organs serve multiple functions without moral hierarchy. The mouth eats and speaks. We don't call speech against the nature of eating. function is not equal to obligation. Second, his taxonomy assumes women are matter, men agents, but this is asserted, not argued. Nothing in the biology of intercourse implies passivity of will. It's read backward from social custom into nature. Third, defining rape / seduction / adultery by whose authority is violated, rather than the woman's consent, makes the wrong entirely relational to property, not to her autonomy. A category error since harm requires a harmed subject, not a violated owner. So I looked at those three objections and I felt that the first one is the one which sort of landed or hit hardest, because it's the one where they actually say this is a fallacy. The other two, and even the other two, the response to the other two, I think I covered in the previous episodes. And if you want to even get a better response to the other two, you have to jump right to the end of the Summa where he starts to speak about marriage. And there he speaks about the dignity of women. So in a sense, those are answered later on. But this first objection, which poses the question, are we therefore saying that if a sexual act is not about bearing children, that it is sinful? That, I think, is the biggest objection which most people would have against this entire article which St. Thomas Aquinas went into. So I took that article, I took the objections that had been put forward to it, and using all of that, I crafted what I would like to imagine would have been St. Thomas's reply to this in this day and age where he alive today and writing today. And so that is what we're going to be discussing in this specific episode. And the question is whether sexual acts that cannot result in childbearing are sinful. So there's a link to this. You won't find it anywhere. I kind of wrote it myself, and there's a link to this particular text in the show description. So I'd really encourage you to read along as I'm reading. One of the things which I did as I was constructing this was I tried to use words and terms which are easier and more familiar to the ear of the modern day listener. You know, St. Thomas uses a lot of technical, theological, and philosophical terms like substance, agent, matter, form, which can throw the average listener off. So all those are kind of like chucked out the window, and we use more down to earth, easier to understand language. So whether sexual acts that cannot result in childbearing are sinful. Objection 1. One power, many uses. So that's another thing which I introduced, because I realized that, when you read St. Thomas, sometimes it's easy to lose track of what the objections were by the time you get to the replies to the objection. But however, that order, there's a logic behind that order, because you can't actually get to the replies to the objections without having given the body of the article, which will then inform the replies to the objection. However, just to make it easy to remember what these objections are, we added kind of like a tag to each one of them, like a really short slogan to remember what the objection is, summarizing the objection in 2 to 3 or 4 words. So, whether sexual acts that cannot result in childbearing are sinful. Objection 1. One purpose, many uses. It would seem that sexual acts that cannot result in childbearing are not sinful, for one power in nature commonly serves several purposes without corruption. The tongue both tastes and speaks. So, the generative power serves not only offspring, but the affection of the two persons. But to argue that because a power can generate, it must be used only so as to generate, is to draw a duty from a bare capacity. And as David Hume observes, what ought to be cannot be deduced from what merely is. That is from A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, who was a British philosopher, Book 3. Therefore, such acts are not sinful. You see, the reason why it's important to mention these guys like Hume, etc., is we don't realize it, but a lot of the way in which we think, our points of view now in the contemporary world, are influenced by a lot of the philosophers who came before us. We just think, oh, this is just the way things are. No, a lot of how we think, our points of view, our perspectives, our opinions, were formed by various philosophers like Jacques Rousseau and David Hume, Karl Marx. It's a whole bunch of philosophers who influence the way we think about the world. So it's important to know where our perspectives and our points of view come from. This is why David Hume features here. Objection 2. Union complete without a child. Further, a good that is whole without a second thing does not depend on it. So I'll give you an example of what this statement means. So for instance, a car. A car is still a car even if a passenger does not sit inside of it and drive it around. It's still a car. So it's complete. You don't need to have a passenger inside it to be able to say this is a car. So a good that is whole without a second thing does not depend on it. But the union of two persons is whole, even where childbearing is impossible, as between the aged or between two of the same sex. The like bonding through such acts is seen even amongst the bonobo, where it makes peace and produces no offspring. So that is from a guy called De Waal, who wrote a study called Bonobo, Sex and Society. What is a bonobo? Bonobo is a kind of monkey. And this guy is a naturalist who observed them and realized that these monkeys would engage in sexual acts even when there was no objective of reproduction, but just to make peace amongst themselves. That's the point that's being driven at here. Therefore, union is a purpose complete in itself, and acts seeking it apart from childbearing are not sinful. Objection 3. The barren are not condemned. Further, what is present in acts that are free of sin cannot be what makes an act sinful. So in other words, when someone performs an act which is not sinful, it's a virtuous act or an act that is completely neutral, that action itself you cannot then turn around and say that action is a sin. Let's say someone is playing the piano. That is can be a neutral or a good act, and let's say it's not a sinful act in that particular instance. Playing the piano is a rather neutral thing. You cannot then turn around and say playing the piano is sinful, whereas playing the piano is not sinful. It's just like it's a contradiction. It's a contradiction, and that is what this objection is driving at. And it says, but the inability to result in childbearing is present in the act of a barren couple and of a wife past childbearing age, which no one calls sinful. The embrace of a man of 70 and his aged wife cannot produce a child, yet is honorable. It is not sinful. Therefore, the mere inability to result in childbearing does not make a sexual act sinful. On the contrary, the apostle says in Romans 1:26-27 that some exchanged the natural use for that which is against nature. Now, an act is against nature when it is turned against the very purpose nature placed in it. Therefore, a sexual act deliberately closed against its purpose of childbearing is sinful. Key words to remember there. When an act is deliberately closed, so that is important, deliberately closed, and another phrase, turned against. When it is turned against, deliberately closed. So it's implied there that the will plays a role, that a decision is made. I answer that. The whole question turns on a distinction that must be drawn first. A sexual act may fail to result in childbearing in two ways. Either the will of those acting is closed against childbearing, whether by excluding that purpose of childbearing or by taking steps to hinder childbearing. Or the will remains open to childbearing and nature alone withholds the outcome because the body is barren or the fertile season has passed. Everything depends on which of the two is meant, and the word that marks the difference is openness. Openness must be understood exactly. It does not mean a couple must each time deliberately intend a child. They may come together in tenderness with no such thought. It means they are inwardly willing to permit that purpose and do nothing to bar it, do nothing to prevent it. A child is not sought, but neither is it refused. This is what humane vitae means in teaching that every conjugal act must remain open to the transmission of life, the uniting and the life-giving purposes being joined by nature and not to be deliberately divided. We'll unpack that shortly, but just to give a context, what is humane vitae? I would say humane vitae is probably the least popular encyclical or letter ever written by any pope in history. So this was written by Pope Paul VI in, I believe it was 1964. I could be mistaken. Towards the tail end of the Second Vatican Council, or it ended already. Look, my facts are wonky about the exact year and the exact timing, but I think it was 64. And Pope Paul VI wrote this because there was like a hue and cry in the church in the wake of the sexual revolution and the invention of the contraceptive pill, saying, hey, should Catholics use contraception or not? And there was a tremendous amount of pressure on the Pope and the bishops to say, hey, guys, it's the 20th century, guys, wake up, come on, you got to modernize, like catch up with the times. Everyone's using the pill now. How can you say Catholics shouldn't use the pill? Because there's a lot of pressure, and the Pope came out with this. He studied the issue, consulted his bishops, consulted experts, consulted lay people, family men and women, took his time, and then he studied the issue, and then he wrote an encyclical or a letter that was titled On Human Life. This is the least popular, least quoted, least spoken about letter in the history of the Catholic Church. But if you go to the Vatican website and look for it, you will find it. So in our next episode, we shall pick up from where we've left off here, which is this discussion around the idea of openness to life in the sexual act, and carry on with the replies to the objections.